Emma sat hunched in the corner of the parking lot, knees drawn to her chest, her thin arms wrapped tightly around herself. The air bit at her skin, seeping through the worn-out jacket that barely covered her frail frame. Brooklyn's winter had no mercy. She watched as people hurried past, bundled in thick coats, their faces buried in scarves. No one looked her way. It was as if she didn't exist. A blur of colors, boots clomping on the pavement, and the endless stream of indifference passed her by, unnoticed and uncaring. Her stomach growled again, a hollow sound that had been with her for days. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in nearly a week, only picking at the remnants of food she found in dumpsters. The cold made everything worse, tightening her muscles, dulling her senses. She rubbed her hands together, but the warmth never came. Across the lot, a man tossed an empty coffee cup onto the sidewalk. Emma's eyes fixed on it, her heart racing with a sudden, desperate hope. Maybe there was something left in it, just a few drops. The thought of even a little warmth spreading through her made her mouth water. Slowly, she stood up, her legs shaky from the cold and hunger, and shuffled toward the discarded cup. Her fingers, pale and numb, reached down and picked it up. It was lighter than she hoped. She peered inside, her heart sinking as she saw only a few faint stains of coffee around the rim. But she wasn't ready to give up just yet. She tilted the cup carefully, hoping for a miracle, and a small drop of lukewarm coffee slid down the side. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she eagerly brought the cup to her lips, taking in the tiny bit of liquid like it was a gift. "Emma!" The harsh voice cut through the cold like a whip. She froze, her hand still holding the cup close to her lips. Slowly she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother, Jessica, stood a few feet away, her face twisted in fury. Emma's stomach dropped. "What the hell are you doing?" Jessica stormed toward her, eyes wild with anger. She snatched the cup out of Emma's hand and flung it across the parking lot. "Stealing now, huh? How much did you take? Don't you dare lie to me!" Emma shook her head, the words stuck in her throat. She hadn't stolen anything. But it didn't matter what she said. Jessica's mind was already made up. Her mother's grip tightened around her wrist, yanking her closer, her nails digging into Emma's skin. The cold air seemed to thicken, wrapping around them as Jessica's voice rose above the city's hum. "You think you can just take whatever you want, don't you? Is this how you repay me for everything I've done? By sneaking around and stealing from people?" Emma's chest tightened, her eyes darting toward the ground. She couldn't look her mother in the eye, not when Jessica's rage was burning so close. It was the same every time, the fury, the accusations, and Emma's silent attempts to disappear. She had learned a long time ago that explaining herself only made things worse. Jessica's breath came out in angry puffs, visible in the freezing air. "You ungrateful little—" She cut herself off, looking around as if daring someone to step in, but no one would. No one ever did. "I didn't steal," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What did you just say?" Jessica's grip tightened. Emma winced but kept her head down, fighting the urge to pull away. It would only make things worse. I didn't steal anything." Jessica let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, so you didn't, huh? Just wandering around like some beggar, picking up trash from the street?" She paused, eyes narrowing. "Is that what you've become? A scavenger?" Emma said nothing. She knew how this went. The longer she stayed quiet, the sooner it would end. Jessica let go of her wrist with a shove, making Emma stumble back a few steps. The weight of her mother's disdain hung heavy in the air. "You disgust me," she spat. "Look at yourself. Pathetic." Emma's eyes stung, but she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Crying never helped. It only made her feel weaker. "Get home. Jessica barked, turning on her heel. Now. Emma followed, her steps slow and heavy, her head low. The parking lot stretched behind her, the discarded coffee cup lying forgotten in the street. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet kept moving forward, dragging her back to the cold apartment that had never been a home. Emma trudged behind Jessica as they made their way back to the apartment, her breath coming out in quick, uneven puffs in the cold evening air. The neighborhood of Queens felt as lifeless as it had every other night. Rows of dilapidated buildings, their windows cracked or covered in grime. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely penetrated the gloom. They reached the front steps of their building, the bricks crumbling under the weight of years of neglect. Emma hesitated at the door, the familiar knot tightening in her stomach. Jessica fumbled for the keys, muttering under her breath, her frustration palpable. The heavy door groaned open, and the dimly lit hallway welcomed them with the smell of dampness and stale air. Inside, the apartment wasn't much better. The walls were a faded beige, streaked with marks from years of wear and neglect. The single light bulb in the main room flickered, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the cramped space. A couch, its fabric worn thin, slumped against the far wall. The radiator in the corner sputtered weakly, offering little relief from the biting cold that crept in through the cracked windows. Jessica flung her purse onto the couch and turned sharply to face Emma. Her eyes, hard and accusing, drilled into her daughter as she crossed her arms, her body rigid with anger. "Don't think I've forgotten about earlier," Jessica said, her voice low but sharp. "Where'd you get the coffee, Emma? You think I'm stupid?" Emma swallowed hard, her hands clenched at her sides. "I didn't steal it. It was on the ground. Someone threw it away." Jessica's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder. "And you thought that was okay? Picking up garbage? Drinking someone else's trash?" "God! Emma, what's wrong with you?" Emma didn't respond. She had learned long ago that silence was her best defense, her way of minimizing the blows, both verbal and physical. Jessica paced the small room, her movements restless, like a caged animal. "I work all day, busting my ass just to keep a roof over our heads, and this is what I come home to? You out there embarrassing me, acting like some street rat." The words stung, but Emma kept her head down, her eyes focused on the scuffed floor beneath her feet. She could hear Jessica's footsteps, the sharp sound of her shoes against the cheap linoleum. Each step felt like a countdown, ticking away the seconds until her mother's rage would boil over. "Look at me!" Jessica snapped. Emma reluctantly lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting Jessica's cold, unforgiving stare. "I don't know why I bother," Jessica said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're useless. Always have been. Can't even go a day without screwing something up. And now you're out there, making us look like we can't take care of ourselves. You want people thinking we're trash, Emma?" "No," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "No?" Jessica scoffed, her lip curling. "You're not convincing anyone. Especially not me." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Jessica stood still for a moment, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes narrowing as she looked Emma up and down, as if searching for something more to criticize. "I'm tired of you, Emma," she said finally, her voice quiet but full of venom. "I'm tired of having to deal with your mess. You're just like your father, useless." Emma flinched at the mention of her father. It wasn't the first time Jessica had brought him up, always in the same disdainful tone, as if the very thought of him was an insult. Jessica sighed heavily, running a hand through her messy hair. "Go to your room," she muttered. "Get out of my sight." Emma didn't hesitate. She turned quickly and slipped down the narrow hallway to her small bedroom at the back of the apartment. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the sparse, cold room that she had called her own for as long as she could remember. A single bed sat in the corner, the mattress lumpy and covered with a thin blanket. The walls were bare, save for a few cracks that spidered out from the ceiling. Emma closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest tight, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She stood there for a moment, letting the silence of the room envelop her, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside. The apartment felt like a prison, each room a reminder of the life she couldn't escape. The cold seeped in through the walls, wrapping around her like a second skin. She glanced out the small window near her bed, looking down at the street below. Emma crawled into bed, pulling the thin blanket over her shoulders. The springs creaked under her slight weight, and she curled up, tucking her knees to her chest. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the television. Jessica sat on the couch, her eyes distant, staring at nothing. The silence of the present bled into the memories she tried so hard to bury, but tonight they slipped through. She could almost hear it again, the laughter, the music, the promise of a life she had once believed in. Los Angeles had been different. The sky was wide, bright, and the air carried the scent of possibility. Jessica was 19 when she first arrived, starry-eyed and clutching the acceptance letter to the music academy like it was a golden ticket. She could still feel the smooth paper between her fingers, the raised letters spelling out her future. She spent hours practicing in front of her cracked mirror in the tiny apartment she shared with 2 other girls, all of them chasing the same dream. Jessica's voice had filled that cramped space, strong and clear, filled with hope. She would hum softly at first, then belt out the chorus as if the world was listening. She would make it. That's what she'd told herself every day. Los Angeles was a city built on dreams, and she was sure she'd become one of its success stories. Then she met Brian. He'd walked into her life like something out of a movie, handsome, confident, with a crooked smile that made her believe he could be trusted. They met at a local bar, where she sang on weekends to earn a little cash. He sat at the back, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. After the show, he bought her a drink, and from there, everything seemed to fall into place. At first, Brian had been everything she wanted. He listened to her talk about her plans, about the songs she'd write, the albums she'd release. They spent late nights driving down the coast, windows down, her favorite songs on the radio. He'd hold her hand, and they'd talk about the future, how he'd support her career, how they'd build a life together. But the future came faster than either of them expected. Jessica sat now, staring blankly at the yellowed walls of the apartment, remembering the subtle shifts. It started with Brian's silences. He would sit across from her in the diner, his eyes no longer lighting up when she talked about her latest audition. His hand, once warm in hers, would pull away too quickly. He never said it out loud, but she could see it in the way he leaned back in his chair, eyes flickering to the side when she spoke of her dreams. She had ignored it at first, convinced herself that Brian was just tired, maybe overwhelmed. But the nights they spent together became fewer, and when they did meet, his touch felt different, distant, absent. He stopped asking her about the academy, and the smiles they used to share were replaced by empty glances. One evening, after she finished her shift at the bar, she found him waiting outside, his hands in his pockets. She remembered the way his shoulders slumped, the way he shuffled his feet like a man weighed down by something he couldn't escape. She'd asked him what was wrong, but he'd only shrugged. "I don't know if this is working anymore," he'd said, his voice soft but firm. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" she had asked, already knowing the answer but not wanting to hear it. Brian wouldn't meet her eyes. Us. I don't think it's what I thought it would be." Jessica had stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her dreams of a future with him dissolving like sugar in water. The city, once so full of promise, felt suddenly foreign, like it was closing in on her. She had clung to Brian, to the idea of them, as tightly as she had clung to her music. But both were slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The memories burned as Jessica pulled herself back to the present. Brian had left, and with him the life she had imagined. The academy became a distant memory, a fading echo of a dream that never materialized. And now, sitting in a run-down apartment in Queens, the girl who once sang with such hope was long gone, replaced by a woman who couldn't even recognize herself in the mirror. She sighed, standing up from the couch. The weight of what could have been, settled heavily on her shoulders. Jessica glanced toward Emma's closed door, her daughter oblivious to the life Jessica had once dreamed of. The bitterness sat deep within her now, like a wound that never healed. The neighborhood didn't see many people like her. Catherine, with her tailored coat, sharp heels and a sleek black car, stood out like a diamond against gravel. Emma watched from her spot near the park bench, pulling her threadbare hoodie tighter around her shoulders, eyes squinting against the sharp winter wind. The woman didn't belong here, not in Brooklyn, not among the cracked sidewalks and sagging tenements. Catherine moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement, each step more deliberate than the last. Her eyes swept the area, briefly landing on Emma. For a second, their eyes met, and Emma's stomach clenched. She dropped her gaze immediately, staring down at her worn sneakers as if she could disappear. But Catherine's attention had already been caught. The wealthy woman paused, adjusting her expensive-looking scarf, and glanced again in Emma's direction. Emma could feel the weight of that gaze, heavy, evaluating. She kept her head down, but her shoulders tensed, the air around her suddenly colder. From a distance, Jessica watched too. She stood just outside the dingy grocery store, cigarettes in hand, but her eyes were locked on Catherine. There was a calculating look in them, the same kind of look she'd given to anything that could mean an advantage. Jessica hadn't said much about it, but Emma could sense her mother's interest. She'd been watching Catherine for days, noting the times she came and went, the way her car always appeared outside the new house with the high brick walls. "Stay here," Jessica said, throwing the cigarette to the ground and grinding it under her boot. Emma glanced up at her mother, the usual tension tightening in her chest. She nodded and stayed where she was, though her eyes followed Jessica as she made her way toward Catherine. From a distance, the exchange seemed polite, even friendly. Catherine smiled, her perfect white teeth gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jessica's posture was stiff, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets, but there was something eager in the way she spoke, like she was waiting for a lifeline to be tossed her way. Emma watched the scene unfold, unease crawling up her spine. Her mother's expression was hard to read from this far, but she knew Jessica was up to something. Jessica always had a plan, even when things seemed chaotic. And Catherine? There was something about her, something unsettling behind that charming exterior. After a few minutes, the conversation ended. Catherine handed Jessica a business card, her smile never wavering. Jessica took it, nodding, and then turned sharply on her heel, walking back toward Emma. Catherine glanced once more in Emma's direction before heading to her car. The engine purred to life, and within moments she was gone. leaving only the echo of her heels and the scent of expensive perfume lingering in the cold air. "What did she want?" Emma asked as her mother approached. Jessica tucked the card into her pocket. "Nothing you need to worry about." Emma wasn't satisfied with the answer, but she knew better than to press. Her mother had that tone in her voice, the one that meant she had a plan, and Emma was expected to follow along quietly. Jessica sat down on the bench next to her, lighting another cigarette. She exhaled slowly, the smoke curling into the air. "She's looking for help," Jessica said after a moment, her voice quieter now, as if she were thinking aloud. "Might be good for us." Emma didn't say anything. She just sat there, watching the smoke drift away, her thoughts tangled in the quiet that followed. Help? From someone like Catherine? It didn't sit right with her. There was something too neat about the woman, something that didn't belong in their messy world. But she didn't know how to say that, didn't know how to explain the knot of discomfort that had taken root in her stomach since Catherine first looked at her. Later that night, as Emma lay in bed, the cold creeping in through the cracks in the walls, she thought about the woman in the tailored coat, about her eyes, sharp and cold, even when she smiled. She thought about how her mother had tucked the business card away like it was a ticket to something better. But something inside Emma whispered that it wasn't. Emma sat on the faded couch in the corner of their tiny living room, watching her mother pace back and forth. Jessica's steps were quick, impatient, as she muttered under her breath. Emma knew better than to interrupt. She had seen this kind of restlessness before. It usually ended with Jessica storming out, leaving Emma behind in the cold apartment with little explanation. "Sit up straight, Emma," Jessica snapped, her voice sharp, cutting through the dull hum of the city outside. "Catherine's coming over soon. You don't want her to think you're some slouch, do you?" Emma shifted, her back straightening out of habit rather than desire. Catherine had been visiting more frequently over the past few weeks, her presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. She would arrive with her polished appearance, smiling warmly at Emma while always maintaining an air of something could done. It hadn't started this way. At first it was simple enough. Catherine would drop by for a coffee, talking to Jessica about things Emma didn't understand. Real estate, stocks, investments. Jessica always seemed on edge around Catherine, though she did her best to hide it. There was always a sense of obligation when she spoke to Catherine, like she owed something, though Emma could never quite figure out what it was. Today felt different. Jessica had been fidgeting all morning, her usual tired eyes darting toward the door every few minutes. Emma could feel the shift, though she couldn't explain why. The knock came suddenly, breaking the uneasy quiet that had settled over the room. Jessica hurried to the door, her heels clacking on the floor. When she opened it, Catherine stood there, her usual perfect self. Blonde hair neatly pinned, expensive coat draped over her slim frame. She smiled when she saw Emma, her eyes lingering a little too long. "Hello, Emma," Catherine said, her voice smooth. "It's always nice to see you." Emma offered a small, forced smile in return. "Hi." "Come in, Catherine," Jessica said, stepping aside to let her enter. "We should talk." Catherine's heels clicked softly on the floor as she made her way to the center of the room. She didn't sit down, though. Instead, she stood there, looking between Jessica and Emma, as if measuring them both. Jessica cleared her throat, glancing at Emma. "Listen, Emma," she started, her tone lighter than usual. "I've got some things I need to take care of. Work stuff." Her eyes darted toward Catherine, then back to Emma. "So, you're going to stay with Catherine for a few days, okay? Just until I can get everything sorted." The words hit Emma like a cold gust of wind. Stay with Catherine? Alone. The idea of it made her stomach twist. She liked Catherine well enough, at least she thought she did, but something about the way Catherine smiled, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long, had always put Emma on edge. But Emma knew there was no room for argument. Jessica had already decided. "Okay," Emma whispered, her voice small. Jessica nodded, satisfied. "Good. Go grab your things, you'll be leaving soon." As Emma stood and walked toward her room, she could feel Catherine's eyes following her. The weight of that gaze pressed down on her like a heavy coat she couldn't shake off. She gathered her things quickly, just a few clothes stuffed into an old backpack, and returned to the living room. Jessica barely looked at her. They left the apartment together, Jessica leading the way down the stairs, Catherine trailing behind. Outside, Catherine's sleek black car was waiting. Emma hesitated for just a second before getting in the back seat. The leather was cold beneath her as she buckled herself in, her heart pounding softly in her chest. The drive to Catherine's house felt like a blur. The city passed by in shades of grey and white, the winter sky heavy with clouds. Emma stared out the window, her mind racing with unease. She glanced at Jessica in the front seat, hoping for some reassurance, but her mother's face was expressionless, distant. When they arrived at Catherine's house in the Upper East Side, Emma could hardly believe her eyes. It was huge, far bigger than any place she had ever seen. The front door alone was twice her height, and the tall windows gleamed in the fading light. Everything about the house felt cold, like it had been built for appearances rather than comfort. Jessica parked the car and turned to Emma. "You'll be fine here," she said, her voice tight. "Catherine will take care of you." Emma nodded, though her stomach churned. Something about the way Jessica said it, like she was convincing herself, made Emma uneasy. But she didn't say anything. She couldn't. Not now. Jessica gave her a brief, awkward hug before getting back into the car. "I'll come get you in a few days," she called out, though it sounded more like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. And then she was gone. The car disappeared down the street, leaving Emma standing there on the grand doorstep of Catherine's house, feeling small and very much alone. Catherine smiled, stepping forward. "Come inside, Emma. Let's get you settled." Emma hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The house was even colder than it looked. At first, Catherine's house felt like a sanctuary to Emma. It was warm, spacious and clean, so different from the cramped apartment she'd left behind. The ceilings soared high above her head, the floors gleamed with polish, and the windows opened to a world of light and luxury that Emma had never known. Catherine greeted her with a warm smile and a soft voice, offering her food, a comfortable bed, and clothes that weren't torn or too small. For a while, it felt like Emma had walked into another life. In the mornings, Emma would wake to the sound of birds chirping outside the large bay window of her room, the soft sheets wrapping her like a cocoon. Catherine would call her down for breakfast, where fresh fruit, toast, and eggs were laid out on the table. Emma ate slowly, savoring each bite, still not quite believing this was real. Catherine would sit across from her, sipping her coffee with a contented smile, occasionally asking Emma how she was settling in. "Everything okay, Emma?" Catherine would ask, her tone light, but her gaze sharp, as if she were studying Emma's every move. Emma nodded, keeping her replies short. She didn't want to say too much, still not entirely comfortable around Catherine, though the older woman's kindness was undeniable. "Yes, thank you," she'd mumble, trying not to let the unease creeping up her spine show. For the first few days, Emma allowed herself to relax. She explored the house, marveling at the grand piano in the living room, the crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, the paintings on the walls. Catherine was always nearby, hovering at the edges of Emma's vision, watching. The more Emma noticed it, the more her initial feelings of comfort began to fade. The change came gradually, almost imperceptibly. It started with small things, Catherine's requests for help around the house, which at first seemed innocent. "Could you tidy up the kitchen after breakfast, Emma?" she would say, her voice gentle but firm. Emma didn't mind. It felt good to be useful, and besides, Catherine was letting her stay in this beautiful home. But soon the requests became more frequent, more demanding. "Emma, the living room needs dusting," Catherine said one afternoon, handing her a rag without waiting for a reply. "And after that, the laundry needs folding." The tone was different now, less of a request, more of an order. Emma could sense it in the way Catherine's eyes lingered on her, waiting for compliance. Emma did as she was told, though something inside her began to knot tighter with each passing day. The chores piled up, cleaning the kitchen, scrubbing the floors, washing windows. At first, Catherine was kind about it, offering words of praise and occasionally a small treat, like a piece of chocolate or an extra blanket. But as the tasks grew, so did Catherine's impatience. The warm smiles disappeared, replaced by cold, critical stares if Emma didn't move fast enough or if she missed a spot while cleaning. One evening, after Emma had spent hours cleaning the entire downstairs, she sat down at the kitchen table, exhausted. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten much all day, and dinner wasn't ready yet. Catherine walked in, glanced at Emma, and frowned. "Why are you sitting?" Catherine's voice was tight, her usual pleasant tone replaced by something much sharper. I finished cleaning," Emma said, her voice small, unsure. "Finished? Did you wipe down the counters? What about the bathroom upstairs? Or the laundry?" Catherine's questions came fast, her words slicing through Emma's exhaustion. Before Emma could answer, Catherine's face hardened. "No food until it's done," she said, her eyes narrowing. Emma stared at her, momentarily frozen. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she stood up without a word and went back to work. The feeling of warmth that Catherine's house had once provided was gone, replaced by a growing sense of suffocation. As the days passed, the chores became endless. Catherine's once kind face was now a mask of irritation whenever Emma was near. If Emma made a mistake, a dish left unwashed or a spot of dust missed, Catherine's punishment was swift, though subtle. A missed meal, a harsh word. The soft bed she'd once loved now felt cold and far away as the blankets became thinner and the nights colder. Emma's hands ached from scrubbing floors, her back sore from carrying loads of laundry up and down the stairs. She tried to keep up, tried to stay in Catherine's good graces, but the house seemed to expand with every task, every demand. There was always something else to clean, something else to fix. Catherine's cruelty wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, lurking in every command, in every withheld meal. Emma began to realize that this place wasn't a home. It was a prison. The rooms that had once seemed so large and inviting now felt too big, too empty. The light through the windows felt cold, and the grandness of the house no longer amazed her. It only reminded her of how small and powerless she was. It was just after 3 a.m., and the house was still. The only sound came from the soft ticking of a clock in the hallway, each second stretching out like a lifeline for Emma. She lay in her bed, fully dressed, her heart thudding in her chest. This was it, the night she had been planning for weeks. The keys were hidden in Catherine's room. And if she could get them without waking her, she'd have a chance. The bruises on her arms ached as she slowly sat up, but she couldn't afford to think about the pain. Catherine's punishments had become harsher, more violent. The last time, Emma had stumbled into her room, shaking after Catherine had slammed her against the kitchen counter. She remembered Catherine's cold words. "You brought this on yourself." That was the night Emma had decided she had to leave, no matter the risk. She slipped her feet into her shoes, careful not to make a sound. The darkness in the house was suffocating, but her eyes had grown used to it. She knew the creaks in the floorboards, the spots to avoid. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her door, wincing as it creaked softly. But no sound came from Catherine's room. Emma stepped into the hallway, her body tensed for any noise, her heart pounding in her ears. She crept forward, her breath shallow, as she reached Catherine's door. It was slightly ajar, and from inside she could hear Catherine's slow, steady breathing. The keys were on the dresser. Emma could see the faint glint of them in the darkness. She paused, glancing toward Catherine's bed, where her figure lay still beneath the heavy blankets. Emma took a slow breath and stepped inside. Each step felt like a mile, her movements cautious and deliberate. She reached the dresser, her hand closing around the cool metal of the keys. For a moment she froze, terrified that the sound had been too loud, but Catherine didn't stir. Emma backed away, moving slowly, her eyes never leaving the bed. The door was only a few feet away now. She just had to get through it. Her hand touched the doorframe when a floorboard creaked under her weight. Catherine shifted. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched Catherine turn over, muttering something in her sleep. For a second, Emma thought her heart might stop. But then, silence. Catherine's breathing evened out again. Emma didn't wait. She slipped out of the room and into the hallway, moving faster now, her hands clutching the keys like a lifeline. The front door was just ahead, and beyond it, the dark, empty streets of Manhattan. She reached the door, hands shaking as she fit the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked, louder than she expected. Her heart raced. She turned the knob, pulling the door open as quietly as she could, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. Outside, the world was different. It was vast, empty, and foreboding. The quiet of the pre-dawn hours made the streets seem both inviting and dangerous. Emma stepped out, closing the door behind her, her breath forming small clouds in the icy air. She took off down the steps, her legs trembling beneath her. The city stretched out before her, dark alleys and towering buildings, every shadow hiding a possible threat. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every footstep echoed in the silence, but Emma didn't look back. The fear was there, gnawing at her insides, but it was met with something stronger, determination. She darted down an alleyway, her shoes slipping slightly on the damp pavement. The buildings loomed above her, their windows dark, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, her body aching from the tension. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't stop. Not until she was far enough away that Catherine could never find her. She turned another corner, her eyes scanning the streets for any sign of life. The city felt like a maze, each turn bringing her closer to freedom, but also to danger. But Emma had no choice. She had made it this far. A noise behind her made her freeze, a door opening, footsteps. For a moment, panic surged through her. Was Catherine following? She ducked into a narrow alley, pressing herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow, desperate bursts. The footsteps passed. Emma waited, her heart racing before peeking out. The street was empty again. She exhaled slowly, pushing herself away from the wall, and began moving once more. She couldn't afford to stop now. The night stretched on, but Emma didn't slow down. Her body was tired, her muscles aching, but she kept moving. The cold air stung her lungs, and every breath felt like fire, but the thought of what waited behind Catherine's door was enough to keep her going. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Emma saw a flicker of hope in the distance, a small cafe, its lights just flickering on. She pushed forward, her legs burning, her vision blurring, but the sight of safety gave her the strength she needed. She had escaped. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade cold and imposing in the pale morning light. Emma's legs were trembling, her lungs burning from the run, but she forced herself forward. She stumbled up the steps, her shoes scuffing against the concrete, the weight of her escape heavy on her small frame. Inside, the courthouse was silent, the kind of silence that felt too clean, too orderly. It was a stark contrast to the chaos she'd just fled. Emma's eyes darted around, taking in the high ceilings, the polished floors, the rows of wooden benches. Everything seemed too pristine, too far removed from the world she knew. She moved quietly toward one of the benches near the back, sinking into it with a soft thud. Her body ached, the adrenaline from the escape slowly wearing off, leaving only exhaustion. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, and tried to catch her breath. The courtroom was in session, but Emma barely registered the voices around her. A man was speaking, his voice calm and controlled, addressing the judge who sat high above, a gavel resting quietly in his hand. The judge's face was stern but not unkind, his eyes focused intently on the proceedings before him. Judge Phillips. Emma had heard his name before, but never like this. She had never been in a place like this. Everything about it felt foreign, safe, but foreign. As she sat there, trying to steady her breath, she realized her hands were trembling. She clasped them tightly, willing herself to stay calm. But the weight of the past few months, no, the past few years, pressed down on her, and her vision blurred with unshed tears. It was then that Judge Phillips noticed her. His eyes, sharp yet steady, shifted from the courtroom proceedings to the small figure huddled on the bench. He paused, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than expected. "Excuse me." His voice cut through the room, quiet but commanding. "Who is that young girl sitting in the back?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Emma, and she felt the weight of their stares. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought about running. But her legs were too tired, her body too worn out. "Come forward, young lady," the judge said gently, though his tone left no room for disobedience. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. But something in the way he looked at her, calm, patient, gave her the courage to stand. Slowly, she rose from the bench, her legs wobbling slightly, and made her way to the front of the room. The large wooden podium loomed in front of her, and she stopped just short of it, unsure of what to do next. "State your name," Judge Phillips instructed, his voice softening. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma," the judge repeated, leaning forward slightly. "What brings you here?" For a moment, Emma couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight, and her hands clutched the edge of the podium, knuckles white. She could feel everyone watching her, waiting for her to explain why she was here, why she had interrupted the proceedings. But how could she explain everything? How could she put into words the months of fear, the bruises, the hunger, the way Catherine's eyes had darkened with every demand? How could she talk about Jessica, her mother, and the coldness in her voice, the way she had abandoned Emma long before Catherine had taken control? I ran away, she said finally, her voice trembling. From Catherine. She hurt me, made me do everything. And my mom, she left me there. The room was deathly quiet now. Every word Emma spoke seemed to hang in the air, thick with the weight of her story. Judge Phillips didn't move. His eyes locked on Emma's face, his expression unreadable. "Tell me more, Emma," he said quietly. "Take your time." Emma's throat tightened again, but she forced herself to continue. In halting sentences, she recounted everything, the small chores that turned into punishments, the withheld food, the way Catherine's kindness had curdled into cruelty. She spoke about Jessica too, about how her mother had handed her over like she was nothing more than a burden. When she finished, there was a long, heavy silence in the courtroom. Emma stood there, her hands still gripping the edge of the podium, her chest tight with the weight of her confession. Judge Phillips sat back in his chair, his face grave. He looked around the courtroom, then back at Emma. "Thank you for telling me, Emma," he said softly. "We're going to make sure you're safe now." Emma's knees nearly buckled at the words. Safe. It had been so long since she'd felt anything close to safety that the idea seemed foreign, almost impossible. But something about the judge's tone, the calm authority, the certainty, made her believe it, if only for a moment. She stood there, still trembling, as the weight of everything began to lift, just a little. The courtroom felt colder than ever as Emma sat quietly in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The steady voice of the judge filled the room as Catherine stood before him, facing the consequences of her cruelty. Emma didn't look at her. She had no need to see the face of the woman who had made her life a living nightmare. Instead, her focus remained on the words, on the firm, undeniable sound of justice finally being served. The verdict was swift. Catherine was sentenced, her manipulations and abuse laid bare for the court to see. Emma exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to release years of tension from her small frame. The chapter was closed. The chains that had once bound her were broken. When the gavel came down, the finality of it echoed in Emma's chest, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe it was over. Boston was different. The air was crisper here, cooler, but not with the kind of sharpness that had once pierced her skin back in Manhattan. Here it was refreshing, clean. Emma stood by the window of her grandparents' small home, watching the leaves flutter on the trees outside. The house was modest, nothing grand like Catherine's cold mansion, but that was the beauty of it. It felt like home. The warmth that filled the space was undeniable. The scent of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen where Helen, her grandmother, hummed softly as she worked. John, her grandfather, sat in his old armchair, glasses perched on his nose as he read the paper, occasionally glancing up at Emma with a smile that made her feel safe. It was a feeling she was still getting used to. Emma stepped away from the window, her fingers lightly brushing the worn wood of the table beside her. Everything in this house felt lived in, like it had a story to tell. It was so different from the sterile, suffocating atmosphere she had grown accustomed to. Here, the furniture didn't feel like it was watching her. The walls didn't close in on her. There were no hidden motives in the corners of the rooms, just warmth and quiet and safety. "Emma, sweetheart, could you set the table?" Helen's voice drifted from the kitchen, gentle and kind. Emma moved without hesitation, grabbing the plates from the cupboard. She arranged them carefully, her hands steady, her movements sure. There was no rush, no fear of making a mistake. Here, things were different. John looked up from his paper, watching her with soft eyes. "You're getting faster every day," he said with a small smile, folding the paper in his lap. Emma gave a shy smile in return, still unaccustomed to the praise, but it felt good. "I've had good practice," she replied quietly. John nodded, his expression understanding. "You're doing just fine, Emma. We're glad you're here." The words hit Emma with a quiet force. She wasn't used to hearing them, people being glad she was around, but she could see it in his eyes, in the way Helen always made sure she was included in every small task. This wasn't like before. There were no hidden agendas, no threats disguised as kindness, just love, quiet and steady. As the evening wore on and they sat down to dinner, Emma found herself relaxing more than she had in years. Her grandparents' conversations were light, full of stories from the past, laughter filling the small kitchen. She listened, slowly allowing herself to feel a part of this world, their world. But even in the warmth, the shadows of her past lingered. They came in small moments, flashes of memory, the coldness of Catherine's voice, the sharp sting of hunger, the feeling of always waiting for something terrible to happen. Sometimes they crept in when she least expected it, catching her off guard. Yet, every time they surfaced, there was something else now. A new strength inside her. It wasn't loud or overpowering, but it was there. A quiet resilience that had been forged in the darkest moments of her life. And now, in the light of this new beginning, it held her steady. The adoption papers were still in progress, but Emma already felt like she belonged. John and Helen didn't need legal documents to make her feel like family. They had taken her in, not out of obligation, but because they wanted her here. That knowledge, more than anything, was what made her start to heal. As Emma helped clear the table, John caught her eye and gave her a soft, knowing smile. "You're going to be just fine," he said gently, as if reading her thoughts. Emma smiled back, the weight of his words settling into her bones. For the first time in a long time, she believed it. Here, in this small house with its worn furniture and warm smiles, Emma was safe. She was home. And that's the incredible journey of Emma, one of strength, resilience, and the power of finding hope, even in the darkest moments. If this story touched you as much as it did me, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a little light in their life. And remember, no matter where you come from or what you've been through, there's always a chance for a new beginning. If you're new here, welcome to the community. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. We've got plenty more coming your way. And as always, drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing what you think. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the power of second chances. See you soon.